touching on the environment of Nantucket Sound. Our three speakers will discuss the sound and the environment that sound makes the sound so unique and diverse. They'll touch on wildlife, birds, sea turtles that call Nantucket Sound home. We have Seth Engelbourg. There he is. He's the Naturalist Educator and Program Manager at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. Seth develops and implements environmental educational programs. He leads the group's birding field trips, coordinates avian research on their 275-acre property. Seth will be discussing the birds found in and around Nantucket Sound. Zak Mertz is the CEO of the New England Wildlife Centers, which includes the Birdsey Cape Wildlife Center in Barnstable and the Thomas E. Curtis Wildlife Hospital. Zak also serves on the executive committee of the New England Wildlife Center, where he teaches students of all ages about the natural world and provides professional training experiences to wildlife rehabilitators and veterinary care professionals. Zak will cover the natural history, biodiversity of the wildlife that call Nantucket Sound home. And finally, Moore Dourdeville is the Sea Turtle Research Coordinator for Mass Audubon's Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary. I was worried I was not going to be able to say that properly. Working in all aspects of the sea turtle rescue, recovery, and research program. She started her work with protected marine species at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Karen will present an overview of the various sea turtles that feed in and around Nantucket Sound.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Seth Engelbourg. I'm the Naturalist Educator and Program Manager at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, which is on Nantucket Island. I live and work year-round on Nantucket Island, but our center is very close to Nantucket Sound. So I'll be talking from the south side of Nantucket Sound today rather than the north side. So here's some pictures of me doing various bird-related things, banding, taking samples for highly pathogenic avian influenza, tagging, just going out bird watching. Most of these things are from Nantucket Sound. And as many people have shown today already, this is the approximate boundary of Nantucket Sound. Nantucket Island is at the south part of the sound. And I'd be remiss to not talk about the organization I work for as well, which is the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. You can see our map here on the property. Property map is the yellow line, so we're not quite on the sound, but our office looks across the Eel Point Road onto Nantucket Sound. And we have a 275-acre property that's mostly upland area, but some Great Pond area as well. And we protect in perpetuity and do research and education on that property. Our organization actually focuses on these three central tenets: research, education, and stewardship. And we see these not as siloed activities, but as facets of our organization that have to interact and correspond with each other. So all of our research informs our stewardship decisions on the property, and all of our education is tied into the research we do. We promote a lot of community and citizen science initiatives where people, no matter what age or what background they have, can be involved in bird research. Myself am a bird biologist by training, and I just want to point out some of the research projects we're doing. We have a long-standing nest box monitoring program on our property, primarily focusing on tree swallows, which is a species of bird that's in global population decline. Some estimates have shown that this species has declined as much as 90% in the last 30 years. So we're providing suitable artificial nest boxes for them and monitoring their success on an annual basis to see if there's birds in the nest, if there's eggs, if there's chicks, and ultimately if those chicks fledge. We're also doing a study looking at how birds respond to restoration. So the area on the right here with these red circles is areas that were formerly Japanese black pine lands, which is a non-native invasive species. And we cut them down a few years ago and are hoping to restore a native sandplain grassland ecosystem, which is a rare habitat. And we're hoping to get some of the birds that rely on that habitat to come back. We also do a lot of education programs related to birds at the Lindner Learning Nature Foundation. We do field trips, we do children's programs, we do outreach seminars, all sorts of things. But today I'm going to talk about what makes Nantucket Sound special in terms of bird diversity. And I want everyone to imagine Nantucket Sound as a meeting point. It's really one of the only places in the entire country where you can have alpine species that would normally live up in the Arctic, like Greenland, places like that, and southern subtropical species in the same environment. So this bird on the right, the snowy egret, Nantucket Sound is actually the absolute maximum northern edge of its range. It doesn't go any farther than that in its breeding season. And the species on the left here is the Barrow's goldeneye. It doesn't go really any farther south than Nantucket. It breeds up in the high Arctic, Canadian Maritimes, places like that. So here in the same environment, we have really bird diversity that represents birds all the way from Central America all the way up to the Arctic Circle. And all those birds, they might not all be here at the same exact time, but they're all coming to Nantucket Sound for specific reasons. It's because Nantucket Sound is not only a historical place, but is an ecologically important, ecologically diverse place. And here are some of the things that Nantucket Sound provides birds. It's an incredible source of food. So birds, especially water birds, seabirds, shorebirds, things like that, are relying on eating mostly fish, or sometimes shellfish, or sometimes birds are eating other birds as well. And these protected environments like a sound or a harbor or an estuary are places that fish really get stuck in. As they migrate through on their ocean journeys, they're looking for sheltered locations, and huge amounts of small bait fish get stuck in Nantucket Sound, which allows for birds like this tern on the left here to find huge amounts of food. And that really brings birds into Nantucket Sound. It's also an incredible source of cover. I mentioned this before, but if you're a seabird spending most of your life out on the open ocean, that can be a rough life. There's wind, there's waves, there's storms, all the things that people talked about in the last panel. Sounds are protected areas, and that brings a lot of birds in, especially in the winter when the weather and the climate is a little bit worse. Tons of birds like sea ducks spend most of their winter in the Sound. Also, we talked about how Nantucket Sound is a water body, but it is related to the land masses that it surrounds. Nantucket, the Vineyard, Elizabeth Islands, and the Cape. And because those communities have done such a good job of protecting their resources and their natural systems, there's awesome nest sites, food, water, and shelter on the land as well, which helps these birds out. So I want to show you a map here. This is a migration map. It's by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And if you look at the different colors, basically the closer to white the color is, the more likely heavy bird migration is predicted in that particular night. And the closer to purple it is, essentially there's no migration. So it's hard to see maybe, but if you go over to Cape Cod and the islands, we're seeing kind of this bright yellow. So not quite as white as the Chesapeake Bay area, but on this night, this was September 30th of 2021, so around this time, just about 2 years ago, there was a huge amount of migratory birds coming through here on their way south as they were going from their breeding grounds in the Arctic or Canadian Maritimes or the Great Lakes, places like that, ultimately going to Central and South America. And fall migration for birds in Nantucket Sound tends to be consistent and steady. Every year, it's good. Shorebirds come through, songbirds come through, waterfowl come through. Spring migration, on the other hand, tends to be a little bit more erratic. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's almost non-existent, but particularly the fall for Nantucket Sound serves as an incredible and important resource for birds as they migrate through in the fall. And where they're migrating through is part of what's called the Atlantic Flyway. These birds you see on the left here, these are two endangered species. We have the roseate tern and the red knot. And I have a couple maps here showing the impact of that. But these birds are long distance migrants. They're going, all across the United States, all the way down into Central and South America. And they're having to fly right past Nantucket and Nantucket Sound. And a lot of people have this vision in their mind of what migration is. Birds go up in the sky, they fly straight, and then they get to their destination. But that's not really how it works. Migration is incredibly taxing for birds. Some birds lose like 50% of their body weight when they're migrating. And they need stopover sites where there's good food and shelter and other resources. And Nantucket Sound is one of these key stopover sites. Without Nantucket Sound, or if Nantucket Sound degraded, they would have to be traveling a lot further to get to their next stopover site. So Nantucket Sound is an incredibly important resource for these birds in migration. And it's also an incredibly important resource during the breeding season. So I mentioned the roseate tern, and this bird on the left is the piping plover. I know some people don't like them because they close beaches off to driving or they cause impacts. But Nantucket, the Cape, the Vineyard, and Nantucket Sound generally is one of the most active, most viable places in the entire country for piping plover breeding. And we should celebrate that. We should respect that. And also look how cute the chicks are. They look like little marshmallows right there. So if you don't like them, that's your problem. But I think we should celebrate that species. And then the last part is wintering. So during the summer, at least on Nantucket, I'm not sure about the Cape, but we basically have 3 species of duck that can be seen on a normal daily basis. In the winter on Nantucket, we have 30 species of duck that can be seen. So that's a 10 times increase. And a lot of these are sea ducks, ducks that are adapted to salt water. And they've bred in areas like the Great Lakes, the Canadian Maritimes, the near Arctic, places like that. And they come into Nantucket, into the harbors, the ponds, the sound, because it's a huge source of food and shelter. So if Nantucket Sound ceased to exist or was developed in some way, one of the most productive winter habitats for waterfowl, certainly on the East Coast, and probably anywhere in the world, would instantly be destroyed. So it is important that we protect Nantucket Sound because of that. And I'm just going to finish my presentation with some pictures of the diversity of birds that we see in Nantucket Sound. We have all these beautiful seabirds, like this razorbill, parasitic jaeger, shearwater, dovekie. A lot of these are kind of the more northern alpine species that I was talking about. We have water birds, cormorants. Everyone's probably seen them before with their wings held out like this. We have great black-backed gulls. A lot of people dismiss gulls as something that will just eat your sandwich on the beach. But the great black-backed gull is actually the largest gull species in the entire world. And that's here every single day in Nantucket Sound and on Nantucket. So we should be celebrating that as well. And then we also have species that people identify more with like Maine or New Hampshire, like the common loon. But those birds don't stay in Maine and New Hampshire the whole year. They come into Nantucket and Nantucket Sound in the winter for a source of food and shelter. Then we have these ducks. These are some of the 30 ducks I was talking about. Long-tailed ducks are a duck that was celebrated for having huge migratory flights. Unfortunately, their populations are a little bit down, but you can still see them in the hundreds or thousands in particular places. Eiders, mergansers, scaup. I mean, we could sit here listing off all the species, but just even with this slide, look at the great diversity of birds we're seeing here. And then shorebirds, and a lot of these shorebirds are some level of endangered or threatened. Piping plover, oyster catcher, the yellowlegs is doing okay, but these are iconic species. These are birds that really need open, undeveloped beaches like the one right out here, and they need that in perpetuity. And unfortunately, because of a lot of development pressure and climate change and sea level rise, their habitats have been reduced. But places like Nantucket, the Cape, Nantucket Sound, that continues to preserve and protect those beaches serve as a refugia for these species. And like the American oyster catcher, breeding records for Nantucket Sound, if you take them in totality between the Vineyard, the Cape, and Nantucket, I think it's the most productive American oyster catcher breeding zone anywhere in the world. So we do have a lot of like special birds and special breeding populations here that need to be protected. And part of that is protecting the resource as a whole. So if we protect Nantucket Sound, we protect not only the history and the culture and the diversity, but we protect the ecology of the sound as well. And with that, I'll end my slides and my presentation and let you go to the next person.
Oh, hi, everybody. So my name's Zach. Pleasure to be here. Thank you guys for all coming out. And so I want to give some context. I'm from the New England Wildlife Center, the Cape Wildlife Center. Much like the two organizations to my left and right, we do focus on conservation, but we do it using the provision of veterinary care to sick, injured, and orphan wildlife. So we run 2 hospitals. We do conserve some land, but our main focus is getting these animals we've heard about in Seth's presentation and others into care, getting them healthy, and getting them back out to the sound where they belong. With that, I just wanted to share a little bit about what that looks like for us. You're going to see some familiar looking slides that Seth included, but I'm going to try to come at them and hopefully add to the good information he just gave you, a little bit about some of the problems those species encounter in the wild, a little bit on what we can do about it, a little bit what you guys can do if you're out there walking the beaches. And I'm sure you're out there recreating, enjoying the sound from time to time. So if you come across a bird that's in need of help, what you can do to help get them into care when they need to. So I just wanted to quickly give a shout out to Linda Loring as well, and particularly Seth. We have been working together. This is the first time we ever met in person, but virtually for a couple of years now, trying to set up a wildlife rescue network on Nantucket. So not only these guys conserve wildlife, but they're also now going out rescuing and picking them up and getting them into care when they need to. So yeah, nice to meet you in person. Okay, so just for some background, we know, we've covered a lot of the habitats of Nantucket Sound, the islands, the Cape. That's great, but the thing that always strikes me when we talk about Nantucket Sound is the animals that get a lot of attention are the birds, obviously you see birds, and then of course our charismatic megafauna, and the charismatic microfauna, if you want to include those plover chicks, they're pretty cute. But the shores of Nantucket Sound are incredibly diverse too, right? We have, I just pulled up this map because this is the MassGIS sort of rare and endangered species habitat out of the Natural Heritage Program. So it's virtually all of it. There are certain endangered species that make this place home, incredibly impactful and a vital resource for them. But this is the graphic that always gets me. And it is just a random screenshot off Google, but the number of habitat types you can count in this photo is amazing, right? You have beach habitat, you have estuary, you have flowing water, you have standing water, you have near shore habitats, onshore habitats, beach, meadow, backyard. Having that type of biodiversity, that densely packed, is something you really don't see in many other places, probably in the world. And included in that is estuarine habitats, which are some of the most productive in the world. But the point is, our habitat here, the place we're lucky enough to use and some of us call home, is just incredibly diverse, but also is a habitat that can support a huge number of wildlife. And we heard a lot about the birds. We heard about, obviously, whales, dolphins, marine mammals that need help. The sea turtles I'm very excited to learn about. But we can't discount it for the more common animals, too. And I should have included some photos here. But you get things like foxes and raccoons and coyotes right down on the beach. And I don't think there's anywhere else in the world where you're going to get raccoons as active as they are here on the Cape. It's the only time I've ever gone to the beach and seen a happy family of raccoons also sharing, looking for crabs and that kind of thing. Having edge habitats, like you can see here where you get meadows and forested areas that back right up to an open expanse of beach is incredible, right? That's where those animals, the land animals, are going to go for cover. They can come out, feed at the shoreline with crabs, fish, whatever it may be, and return to the cover of the meadow or trees or whatever it may be. So as we go through, I just want to point that out, where I will try to focus a little bit on some of the more common species you'll see in your backyard too, because truly they are, part of the food chain, and some of the more common animals are the most important, right? They make up the base of the food chain, and they make it so that some of our larger predators and some of the less, more endangered animals have something to eat as well. So just quickly, I wanted to take a quick screen grab here. This is the sound. It changes a lot for different seasons, right? And, for us people, we put on coats or we put on shorts or whatever it is. But for animals, that has a big impact. And as Seth mentioned, migration is a big part of that. So if you can get out of Dodge when it starts to get cold, good for you. I'm sure some of us do that too. But there's a lot of animals that are stuck here year round. All the terrestrial animals, the turtles, not the sea turtles, but the land turtles, and a lot of our local wildlife. And so there's a big change. You get a big change in forest cover. There can be snow cover. I was really fascinated to hear about how much the sound used to ice over. We certainly know some of the predators will use that to their advantage. And then certainly there are some birds that don't quite get it and try to land on the ice when they probably shouldn't. And we get a lot of those calls every year. Sometimes they're just resting on the ice, but people think they're stuck to the ice. If you see a bird stuck to the ice, it's not. Don't worry about it. That generally doesn't happen. They have very hot feet. So I know we talked a little bit about storms too, but I wanted to be dramatic and put up some of the storm paths. And the reason I bring this up is this, for our hospital, summer is busy, spring is busy, this time of year, very busy. But man, when we get a storm like a nor'easter or a hurricane, our admissions numbers go through the roof. And it is mostly because of seabirds. And it is mostly because these birds that are seeking safe haven, probably in the sound, can't contend with the waves, can't contend with the currents, and get pushed up onto shore. And some are lucky enough just to beach, but some of them get rolled in the waves. Some of them destroy their waterproofing by destroying their feathers. Some of them are actually injured in the process. So when we get a storm, like we thought that last hurricane, we called everybody into the office. We call them bird makers in our line of work. And so we were absolutely ready for a huge bird event, and we got one gannet, I think. So we're grateful, but you never know. This is our front desk receptionist. On a day we took in, I think, 56 gannets in one day. This is a storm 2 years ago. I'm going to use it to talk about a little bit about what happens, how what birds do, and what types of birds are able to contend with a storm and unbeach themselves. So that's Karen. I think we did take in 56 birds, 56 gannets rather. There's probably 100 birds, and of course the power goes out at the same exact time. So we're trying to do 1800 style medicine with by candlelight actually, but we got through it. You can see I just wanted to include this. These are northern gannets, and the blue peak you see there in the middle is our bird admissions that day. And so you can see, as compared to a normal day, our admission numbers go up. But if you're someone like me that likes to walk the shore after a big storm because cool stuff washes up, you may encounter beached, particularly seabirds that are in need of help. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what to do if you see one, and the things you can do to kind of tell if they need extra help or not. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, we'll use a gannet as an example. I'll use the more common species we tend to see, which are, again, gannets, dovekies, which Seth had mentioned. They look like tiny little chicken nugget-sized penguins. Get one call every year where someone's like, a penguin just walked into my basement. I'm like, probably not, but maybe. But they tend to raft together in big groups, and they're only 40, 50 grams in some cases. So a windstorm is like crazy for them, and they get washed up by the hundreds or thousands. And so what we see with most of the pelagic birds, the gannets, loons is a great example, dovekies, is when they get beached, they may be injured. Or it may be that they got pushed so far on shore that they really can't get themselves back to the waterline. And so most of the birds we're used to seeing, using a seagull as an example, their legs are positioned perfectly underneath them. They can stand up, they can walk around. We've also seen seagulls run around a parking lot. A lot of the pelagic birds, their legs are really lateral. I wish I had a picture of a gannet foot on there. I don't think that I do. But anyway, they're positioned really good. They're great swimmers. But because of the orientation of the pelvis, it makes them really bad at walking on land. And in some cases, some of these birds can't even stand up. And so when you get a big storm that pushes a bird on shore, and this is particularly true in Nantucket Sound, just given the geography, because we have so much shoreline surrounding so much open water, a lot of times these birds they will just sit wherever they land, essentially. And so if you were to come across, say, this gannet who looks really angry, they are really angry, by the way, most of the time because they don't want to be there either. If you come across a bird like this, you should call one of our organizations first. But we may try to walk you through a checklist. And that checklist may include anything from gently trying to shuffle the bird to see if it can ambulate on its own, stand up and walk, or more often than not, we may ask you for photos, video, and we may ask you to try to put that bird back in the water in some cases. Or if we think it's injured, we may tell you, you just bring it right on in. So here are my 3 tips for picking up a seabird. A towel is your best friend, which is a great thing at the beach because, most of us bring a towel to the beach. If you're going to pick up a bird with a pointy beak, which most seabirds have, cutting off their eyesight is generally a really good first step, right? It not only calms them down, but it's going to reduce your risk of getting stabbed. I don't know if it's a myth or not, but it seems true to me. They often will go for the eyes. People tell me it's because they look like fish and they're shiny. I think it's because they're mad. But either way, you want to watch your eyes. And that's a joke, but you really do want to watch your eyes. Towel all the way over the bird. Pick it up like a football from the bottom. And the one thing I'll tell you is gannets, they're diving birds. Amazing to watch dive out in open water. But when they dive quickly, they dive really deep. And because of that, they don't really have nostrils or nares. And so you never want to hold a gannet's mouth closed. With other seabirds, you can get away with that if you're trying to restrain them, but you never want to do that because they can't breathe if you do that way. Okay, so that's just sort of a tip. Again, you can call us, but using a towel all the way over the bird, scooping it up, watching your eyes, watch the beak, is generally the safest way. And you want to put them into a box or a crate that is not metal because we want to preserve their ability to float and weatherproof and all that kind of stuff. So these are just some of the patients in the last year that we have taken in from the Sound. As Seth mentioned, incredible diversity. They do run into a lot of different trouble for a lot of different reasons, but this time of year, sitting here in September, it's mostly going to be storm-driven for us. It is also the time of year where we get the oddballs. So this time of year with the hurricanes, a lot of times you get these low-pressure systems, obviously what drives a storm, and the birds from down south will get caught in the winds or whatever, and they may find the eye of the storm and they may travel with it. And so over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been getting some odd birds, and we had wood storks last year. We had, Seth mentioned a lot of snowy egrets. We just released one 2 days ago. But it's a really cool time to be a birder, especially out here on the Sound, especially after a storm. You may see some weird ones. There was, I don't know if you guys saw, there's a bunch of flamingos that scattered across the country a couple weeks ago. They got as far north, I think, as like Virginia. I was really hoping we would see one because they're my favorite bird, but we did not get any down here. And Seth mentioned migration, so I'm not going to cover it much. Just know that we are in the Atlantic flyway. And what I will say, and I think he said it perfectly, is we have an incredible habitat here that supports a whole diversity of species from a whole diversity of geographies. And there are times in the season where they tend to congregate, or they may or large groups may cross over, right? So I'm thinking of like terns. A lot of times right now they're staging, they're getting ready to fly to their winter homes. But it means a lot of the chicks, a lot of the adults are getting together in big groups. And they may be using the same space as a group of dovekies or whatever it is, or waterfowl. And avian influenza has been a huge problem over the last few years. I think we've had over 400 or 500 positives in the state, and at least a few hundred positives in our hospital. And what we're seeing, it's ongoing research, but it is impacting susceptible species, which is the list of susceptible species is growing all the time. We know there's at least 4 or 5 different strains out there. And so we're starting to see larger and larger swaths of birds impacted by this. We're not exactly sure what it's doing to the populations yet, but it is something that it's probably going to become endemic here. So we're hoping they cope with it. But just know this is also a time of year, if you see multiple birds laid out on the beach or even in your backyard, it is worth calling us or an agency that can help with the state just to let them know we're actively testing for avian influenza. Along with about 5 or 6 other emerging diseases. With the changing climate has come a whole different set of viral evolutions, and at the speed at which they're evolving is a little bit increased. And so, we're all trying to keep ahead of it and just understand what's going on. But if you see, 3, 4, 5 birds in a similar area that are deceased or struggling, it is definitely worth calling that in, because not only will you help those individuals, but it may contribute to a larger body of research that we're all trying to work on. So that's why I bring that up. Is this time of year is great. It's an awesome time to go out and see a lot of birds together, but also know the risk to them is a little bigger than it used to be for different reasons. And I think Seth covered a lot of this. I had put in I originally put in some different types of birds you'll see out here. What I will do, last thing that I do before I turn it over, is I'll just give you some of the quick reasons we see these guys. And so diving ducks are a big one for us. I will tell you, September, October, November, the biggest reason we see them is a little counterintuitive. It is because they're shot. And some of these have open seasons, some of them don't, some of them get confused. But a lot of times, especially in hunting areas, we will get probably 20, 30 eiders a year that come in shot, and we'll do surgery and try to repair them and get them back out where we can. The terns is another great one. These guys, incredible flyers. I don't know if anybody's seen a tern out on the water. They can just sort of hover over the waves. They sort of use a rotary motion and they're flapping. It's amazing. But because of the way their joints are set up, it also lends itself to a lot of orthopedic injuries. Probably the number one reason we'll get a tern in, you can see these big broad wings. Some of the bones in the wing are hollow, and we'll see a lot of wing breaks. So the reason I bring this up is because if you get a tern that's injured, they're a species, because of the stress level and the level of injury, you want to get them into care immediately. They're one that, 24 hours can make a huge difference in whether that bone can be repaired or surgically pinned or, whatever it is. And so you also want to look for wing injuries. So if you found an injured tern, that's one of the things you just sort of visually want to assess is, does one wing look like the other? It just tends to be what we see the most. And I think I'll end my presentation here, just by saying the Sound is an incredible place. It deserves protecting. It deserves protecting because of the animals that live there, the animals that the habitat supports, whether they be migrants or permanent residents, and the people who care about it. It's a rich piece of our history as well. And so these 3 species are truly my favorite animals. I figured I'd leave you with this. The red-throated and common loons, they come up from New Hampshire. This will be their wintering ground. They'll stay offshore. Incredibly important for sustaining their populations. Barn owls, the Cape has 1 or 2 barn owls known, but Nantucket, I believe, is sort of one of their last strongholds in the state, and they're a listed species here in the state. And this is the habitat they chose to try to live in, and we're desperately trying to get them populations up where we can. But right now, Nantucket Sound is one of the only places supporting these guys. And then snowy owls too. Everybody loves snowy owls, and this is the place to come see them. World famous for that. So I think I will cede the rest of my time. And thank you guys.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you to Audra and the organization for inviting me and I think all of us. I'm here to talk about sea turtles, and I love to talk about sea turtles, so I've set my timer so I don't over-talk my allotted time. So first, I'm just going to give a tiny bit of background, natural history about sea turtles and the ones that are here and why they're here and when they're here. There are 7 species of sea turtles in the whole world, and 4 of them, eyes left, are out there right now. We have juvenile Kemp's ridleys. Kemp's ridley is the most endangered sea turtle in the world. I could explain why, but I won't go into that now, but they are here feeding juveniles. So these are primarily dinner plate size, give or take. We have loggerhead sea turtles. In fact, the shore right along here has a lot of loggerheads right now. So any of you that are boaters, have any of you seen sea turtles in the Sound? I thought some would have, yeah. Loggerheads are brown. We mostly have subadults. So the carapace or upper shell in the range of 1.5 to 2.5 feet long. Beautiful colors of brown and some yellow and orange around their head and flippers. And we have greens, again, juveniles. Up until a year ago today, I would have said we only have juveniles, but an event occurred a year ago today on Nantucket, where a mature green sea turtle did what we call a false crawl. Crawled ashore, dug 3 nest pits, did not lay eggs. This was right before a storm. We know it was a green because of the track of that crawling in the sand. Nobody saw the turtle that we know of. Anyway, it's a really interesting story. But other than that one, the only ones we know about are juveniles. And then the gentle giant, the leatherback. And they are out here now. In fact, some colleagues are out in Nantucket Sound today doing research on leatherbacks. These are the 6 to 8 foot long turtles, the giants, certainly of the sea turtle world, in fact, arguably of the reptilian world. They are, all 4 species are here feeding. They don't stay up here through the winter. It's too cold, but this is the chow line. So I'm going to go through very quickly a few slides of each of these species to show you what we want them to look like in the water. This is the Kemp's Ridley, little guy. More Kemp's Ridleys. You can see in this shot on the left, that was taken from a paddleboard. So looking down from a paddleboard, so it gives you a little perspective on size there. Little juvenile Kemp's Ridleys. Another beautiful Kemp's Ridley shot with some algae on it. And then these juvenile greens. We don't know how many greens are here. We don't think too many, but we know they're here because of cold stun strandings, which I'll touch upon in a few minutes. There's another green shot. And then the loggerheads that I mentioned, right out here along your coast, and they're all through the Sound, all around Massachusetts waters, but certainly in the Sound. Loggerheads often, but not always, have a lot of what we call epibionts. That's one organism that grows on another organism. In this case, you can see 3 gooseneck barnacles and algae on those loggerheads. Sometimes we have loggerheads that have absolutely nothing on them. We don't know why. And of course, these are reptiles. They need to breathe air, so there's a loggerhead taking a nice breath at the surface. And this summer, we have graciously gotten footage from the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy from their shark drones. And this was a loggerhead taken from one of their drones looking for white sharks. And this is a little video. So those front flippers are powering. That's the engine. That's what's driving that turtle. And the sailboat in the background probably certainly didn't see it. But of note here is how it's just below the surface. It's not at the surface, it's just below. And then the leatherback, and I love these pictures. Leatherbacks are very different than the other 6 species, besides being huge. They have a lot of physical adaptations that allow them to swim and thrive in much colder water than the other 6 species. But leatherbacks are here. Leatherbacks eat really exclusively gelatinous organisms, jellyfish, and the organisms like jellyfish, like comb jellies, ctenophores. So when you think about it, something 8 feet long might weigh 1,000 pounds, 1,300 pounds, eating something that's 95% water. It's got to eat a lot of them. And they are feeding machines when they are here. A colleague, Cara Dodge from New England Aquarium, has done some tagging, showing behavior. In our waters, they're feeding round the clock, basically, often 23 hours a day feeding. Oh, now this is one on the left. This is a leatherback swimming right at the boat. And that red glob is a lion's mane jelly. If you've seen those out here. They get, in our waters, they get to be about a foot diameter. It's a cold water jelly. So up off eastern Canada, they grow to be 2-3 feet long or wide diameter. But so the leatherbacks, a lot of leatherbacks go up off eastern Canada, off Newfoundland, and are feeding. But they are pretty prehistoric looking, and they're fun to read about. Go home and look up leatherbacks, and you'll be fascinated. This was taken by a diver, Tom Burns. He's a veterinarian here on the Cape, but that's a leatherback underwater with lion's mane streaming out of the side of its mouth. And these are just a few species. These are all photos from Nantucket Sound of a few of the species that they're eating out here, the leatherbacks. And I'm going to show you a couple of short videos of leatherbacks in Nantucket Sound. There is kind of fun audio on this, but we're not getting that. But the little fish, this was taken by a participant in the Martha's Vineyard Striped Bass and Bluefish Derby off of Chappaquiddick. And I think that little fish was a bonito that just jumped right there. But again, I'm showing you these to point out how vulnerable these guys are. I mean, they're big, but when they're at the surface, calm, glary water, they're very difficult to see unless a boater is looking ahead of his or her vessel. And that's a point I'll mention a little more about. Here's another one. So they do rest at the surface. It's sort of like whales. I'm sure you've seen whales or been on whale watches. They'll be feeding at depth and then come up and be basically resting and breathing for a minute or 2 minutes. And so getting a series of breaths. But look how difficult it is to see in that glare. And you'll see a big breath. You'd hear it if you heard audio. And then it sounds. It's really the leatherback's equivalent of a whale sounding, where they're going down for a deeper dive. There it goes. And here's a Nantucket Sound picture by that colleague, Cara Dodge, who has attached by suction cup GoPro cameras to leatherbacks. So do you see in the background 2 ferries? And these leatherbacks have one of the big perils for them in our waters is vessels. Probably not the ferries as much as the small recreational power boats, but they're out here in the ferry channels. So just a really brief touching on, we basically do year-round sea turtle work at Wellfleet Bay, Mass Audubon, even though the sea turtles aren't here year-round. So we have a website, seaturtlesightings.org, where we're trying to get boaters to report sightings of sea turtles. And not only do we have the goal of collecting that data, and we vet these sightings for species reliability, but also the goal is of raising awareness on the part of boaters that they're out here. Watch ahead of your vessel. It'll make a more interesting trip for you, and it may save a sea turtle. And don't go on autopilot. And on that website, you can see maps like this where sea turtles have been seen. This is the 5th year we're not getting a lot of sightings from Nantucket Sound of leatherbacks. We are of loggerheads. But it's good for the leatherbacks. They've been look south of Nantucket there. One of those areas were at least 50 from an aerial survey, and the other cluster was probably 30 to 40 leatherbacks. So they've been a little farther offshore for 5 years, but still in the Sound. And this is just some of the boater outreach we do. When you go out by the front where you came in, I put some yellow key tags and some little flyers that if you are a boater or no boater, please take a couple and pass them out. You can put them on your boat keyring for reporting sightings. And then the stranding response. And of course, all sea turtles are federally protected, all that occur in U.S. waters are federally protected. And all of our work with strandings is under the endangered U.S. Fish and Wildlife permit through the Endangered Species Act. So this just gives you an idea of size. This was a live leatherback, and it took all of those people to lift it back into the water. This was actually Cape Cod Bay several years ago up at the Pamet, but this was a happy stranding because that turtle seemed healthy, probably just got stranded by the tide. And this was a live Kemp's Ridley, again on the Brewster Flats, so Cape Cod Bay, but they're out here too in the Sound. And this one also was a happy ending because we were able to get that turtle, get it to New England Aquarium for a quick health assessment. It was released south of the Cape, West Dennis. But many of the summer strandings that we respond to, Mass Audubon, Wellfleet Bay Sea Turtle staff are the federally permitted and mandated responders to all sea turtle strandings in southeastern Mass. Many of what we see are vessel strike. So that arrow points to those two white gashes. Those are from a propeller. So that's a fatally injured leatherback. This is Nantucket Sound. This was Nantucket Sound just a little east of Nobska Point, Falmouth, several years ago. That's a mature female, so it gives you, again, a size idea. And you see those gashes up the back, a propeller. The marking we do both to identify it, because if the carcass is likely to refloat, it's marked because it could come in somewhere else. This one actually did. It moved about 3 different beaches. And it also lets beach walkers know that that turtle has been responded to. This was one on Nantucket on the north side, Dionys Beach, is that how you say it? Dionys Beach, several years ago. Again, vessel struck, and we do a full beach necropsy when we can, an animal autopsy, and depends on where it is and all sorts of logistics. Loggerheads also get vessel struck. There's one. And then you hear a lot these days about entanglement in regards to right whales, but leatherbacks also become entangled in what we call fixed vertical line fishing gear, like a lobster pot. So you've got a floating pot at the surface, a line down to basically an anchor, a pot at the bottom. And right whales swim in and get entangled, so do leatherbacks. And the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown are the disentanglers, and they are expert at it. They disentangle marine mammals and sea turtles. And often, if the turtle is entangled close enough to the surface that it can breathe, the Center for Coastal Studies can get there or get one of their authorized organizations to disentangle it successfully. Another live entanglement. But occasionally, one of these entangled leatherbacks comes ashore. Not very often, because of what I said before, they're anchored when they're entangled. But sometimes that pot gets cut, or the fisher may cut that line, and so they drift ashore with the entangling gear. And that's where we come into play with our response, and we document that gear. And sometimes cause of death is indeterminate. This was a loggerhead. We do a full beach necropsy, as I said, and take all sorts of data, measurements and photographs and DNA samples, and we look for what it was eating. Often the loggerheads right out here are eating all sorts of crabs, but they eat whelk. They've got a really strong jaw, and they can crush right through a conch or a whelk. And along the shore right now, you've got this algae run, the false albacore are right along here, and lots of fishing going on. And so that if the jellies are dense, which often occurs during that algae run, the loggerheads will eat jellyfish too. And plastic ingestion, we don't know how big a problem this is, honestly. We know microplastics are all over the water, and every marine creature has microplastics. We don't know the full extent of harm or not of that. But the bigger pieces we don't find very often here, luckily. But I put it here just as a reminder. And this slide is really illustrative. On the left is a plastic bag. On the right is a true jellyfish. And so a leatherback swims along, and it's just ingesting one jelly after another. And again, we've seen the footage of this. Be pretty easy to ingest a plastic bag. And I'm not going to talk much about this in deference to time and the fact that most of our cold stun rescue goes on in Cape Cod Bay. So you've heard a lot today, you're all aware of the shape of Cape Cod, of course, but that arm of the Cape is a physical hook for 3 species of sea turtles. So it's for the Kemp's Ridleys, the greens, and the loggerheads. In the fall, like now or soon, as daylight is shortening, we think shortening daylight is a trigger. And then as the waters begin to cool, a lot of these turtles are feeding north of the Cape as well as in Nantucket and Vineyard Sound. They begin going south, and some of those 3 species, get actually physically caught down in Cape Cod Bay by that hook. And the water cools, they're cold-blooded, they get lethargic, they can't get out. So we have over 200 volunteers that we assign to specific beaches at specific wind direction and tides that begin rescuing them. And 85 to 90% are the little juvenile Kemp's Ridley, the most endangered sea turtle in the world. Now, we do have some cold stunning in Nantucket Sound. Last year we had 10 cold stuns wash in on Nantucket. We don't see them along the north side of Nantucket Sound because the prevailing winds, in the winter are more from the north. So turtles are being blown south. And though between those arrows are cold stun beaches. These signs are along all the Cape Cod Bay beaches. And I won't belabor this, but it just shows you the cold stunning numbers are going way up. For probably a number of reasons. There's been some nesting beach successes, which is great. So there are success stories with sea turtles, which is fabulous. But also more with climate change, as with many species, more are moving farther north. So there's a chance for more of them to get caught on that southern migration. Just a couple quick pictures of volunteers rescuing. These are live turtles, but they look dead. That's a loggerhead, because they're just lethargic. On the left, a loggerhead out on the Brewster Flats, and in the center, or on the right, is a Kemp's Ridley that one of our volunteers is wrapping in a towel and putting on a sled. There's a little cold-stunned Kemp's Ridley. They come into Wellfleet Bay Sanctuary by either staff or our trained volunteers, where we do minimal processing, weighing, measuring, photographing, checking for tags, and readying them to go to one of 2 rehab centers. New England Aquarium's Animal Care Center in Quincy takes most of them, and then National Marine Life Center in Buzzards Bay takes a smaller number, and they begin their rehab. The cold stuns, by the time they wash in, are very sick. Those are all live turtles. Some of our staff. And we have trained drivers that drive them to these rehab facilities. Those are 3 loggerheads. The little ones fit in those banana boxes you saw, but the big ones don't. So, and every once in a while, one's a little active and it's like crawling around, and it makes for an interesting trip. So the ultimate goal of the rehab, of course, is release back to the wild. And from Wellfleet Bay, we now have about a 75% live admit to rehab rate. That's dependent on air temperature, a lot of variables, but we've also gotten efficient, and our wonderful volunteers have very efficiently found them and get them off the beach fast. But So this was a release. Most of them get flown south through the course of the cold stun season, and they're released in the south. The toughest cases the New England Aquarium has to keep, and there were a number of releases this summer at the West Dennis Beach, really near here. And this was a Kemp's Ridley release. And I'll end with this little video of a release this summer. These are really happy events. So this turtle's been in rehab for 8 or 9 months. They get set down in the sand and they know what to do. Usually.
Is that blue color on them?
That's paint. They all have an accession number, and that's their number. Wears off pretty quickly. And there they go. They're going home. So that's Nantucket Sound that gets these turtles. Some of the 25% that don't survive, we freeze and then conduct necropsies on at Woods Hole Oceanographic in the spring and learn a lot of things about a very unusual sample set, especially these Kemp's Ridleys. We invite outside researchers to come and take samples, and so thank you very much. Well, the question was about diamondback terrapins, which are not sea turtles, although they're really a marsh turtle, and they swim in salt water, and they're not down on this side of the Cape, but they're on the north side of the Cape, and they're in Buzzards Bay. And we work very closely with Zak because injured diamondback terrapins we send to Zak at Cape Wildlife. So they do a fabulous job. So they're a marsh turtle that doesn't migrate. They brumate, which is reptilian hibernation. They're here, so there's a big population in Wellfleet, Eastham, but this is the northern part of their range. And I don't know, Zak, you might have something.
No, that was perfect. Just to add that this is the hatching time of the year, so it's a really exciting point that all the folks that work in the conservation field, we try to work with groups that protect nests as well, like you guys. Terrapins in general have a long history on the East Coast and on Cape Cod. There's been a number of human and environmental pressures that have led to some decline in their population, everything from the pet trade to land development, things like that. And so we've lost a lot, but over the last decade, 2 decades, there's been some incredible conservation efforts through Mass Audubon and other local groups to protect the nesting spots so that we can get the populations up. But turtles are nothing if not stubborn, and they like to return to their same nesting grounds year after year, whether they are in the same condition that they left them or not.
So just to be clear, the terrapins nest here, but they're not sea turtles. Sea turtles, with that exception on Nantucket, but we don't know about that. Okay. Yeah, the question is about the critically endangered Kemp's Ridleys. Is there an effort to increase numbers south? Yes. One of the reasons, well, really the main reason, the starting main reason that they're critically endangered is that they're one genetic population. Most of them, 95% of them, are born on a 31-mile stretch of beach in eastern Mexico. Now, the U.S. government and the Mexican government has really worked hard at protecting that area and getting researchers in there. Unfortunately, now drug cartels control parts of that stretch. It's a really dicey place. But there is a nesting that's been started on Padre Island in Texas, if any of you know that. So these were eggs taken from this Rancho Nuevo is what the Mexican beach is called, were taken to Padre Island, South Padre Island in Texas. The nests were planted there so that when the turtles hatched, they implanted on Padre Island, and there have been returns now. I mean, we know it's working, but it's a small number. And there's a call for, I mean, there are outlier nests in Florida, up along the East Coast. There are outlier Ridley's nests. There was one on Long Island, New York, 3 years ago that successfully, the eggs were removed, but then when they hatched, they were taken back there, and the eggs were released. It was like 80% success hatching. But those are outliers. And so there's a lot of desire, to increase nesting habitat. We can't keep things from going north. I mean, yeah. The question was, are we still collecting banana boxes? And the answer is, at times. I mean, just call. Well, we can't store them all at once. So if you call and just say, do you need them? And they'll say yes or no, right? It's like a faucet on and off. Thank you, though, for donating them.
Do you know what the story is or the background to the name, Kemp's Ridley?
Yeah, Richard Kemp was a biologist. I mean, again, I don't want to monopolize the conversation here. You could go read the story of the Kemp's Ridley. Until the 1940s, it was not even thought to be a species by biologists. It was thought to be a hybrid between green and loggerhead because nobody saw them nest. It was in this one little stretch of eastern Mexico, and so people weren't seeing them. And Richard Kemp was one of the early people to describe them. And the Ridley is a little less clear. There's some talk that it just meant the riddle of the Ridley, but I can't give you more on that. But read about it because it's a fascinating story. It makes you cry. Uh-huh.
So Seth, in the beginning you said sounds are protected. So what laws are in place right now to protect our sounds? And then for all three of you, Karen, Zak, and Seth, what's the current number of endangered species of endangered birds and turtles? And just one last question. We had a favorite seal washed up with his head off, and there were rumors a turtle also had lost his head, so that indicates boat strike, not anything else. So, if you can just answer those questions.
Sure, thank you. So I said sounds are protected. I meant in an ecological sense that, the water is calmer there. There's not as much wave and wind environment because it's protected from the land. In terms of what types of legal protections exist, that was talked about by, Audrey earlier with the Ocean Act. I forget exactly what it's called, but Massachusetts Ocean Sanctuaries Act, thank you. But I know it's the goal of their organization to try to get additional legal protection. I was really talking about from a physical and ecological standpoint, how it's much more of a calm environment rather than the open ocean.
And how many endangered species are there with the birds and turtles right now?
So that one fluctuates. In terms of the birds, I don't think I could name them all that are both year-round and pass through. I will tell you, in terms of protections for the birds, our biggest legislatively, the biggest one has been the Migratory Bird Protection Act. Most of the birds in the state are federally protected under that act. And there's, just to clarify, there's two levels of protection. When you say something's endangered or a listed species, it can be listed here in Massachusetts on a state level and be thriving elsewhere in the country and not be listed, or vice versa. Or you can have species, things like the storm petrel, that are listed at a national level. And so there are, I would guess over 30, probably over 50 different species here that are listed in some form. But if you go to the state's website, mass.gov, you can see an ever-changing list of what's listed, what's been delisted, pretty easily right there. I'm not sure. Is it the same for turtles?
Yeah, all 4 species are here are federally protected. Either 2 are endangered, 2 are threatened.
I would just say, too, the best place of information is the Massachusetts Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. So that's going to have all of the information for all taxa, not just birds or turtles, but plants, insects, mammals, anything that has some type of status in Massachusetts. There will be information on it. And a lot of the species have complete info guides that you can learn all about how they're doing in the state and also around the country. The map that Zak showed with all of those hashed out areas, that is the NHESP map showing all the areas that are considered habitat for endangered species.
I have a question if you want to break now, or I have two quick ones. Are the blackbacks growing all the time and the herring gulls going down? That's one question, because you were talking about whites, and my observation is there are more and more blackbacks, but maybe not enough. Secondly, you were talking about avian flu, and you did not make the connection between avian flu and gray seal pups. I happen to have a connection with Muskegon, and it's about 50% of the gray seal pups in Muskegon have avian flu. So I'm interested in both questions.
Sure. So the second question first, it was asking about or observing that there has been AI avian influenza observed in seal populations, which is true. Just by way of short background, there are, at least in birds, and I believe in seals too, there are two essentially versions of avian influenzas. Highly pathogenic avian influenza, which is the one we're worried about. It's the one that's extremely virulent, can cause high mortality. And then there's low pathogenic or low path. And that one has been circulating in bird populations for a long time, less severe, not as much of an environmental concern. And so when we talk about testing, we're talking about, we call it HPAI, which is the high path version. And yes, there has been crossover into seals as well as some other species as well. I believe there was some evidence up in Canada, an early detection that it had crossed from, I think, swans to seals to red fox, maybe another species or two. And so with all viruses, there's always the risk that it may mutate, may find a new host, or it may just be small blips in a larger data set. But yeah, the seal-bird connection is an important one, especially here in the Sound, especially on Cape Cod, where you have an incredible number of bird species sharing space with sunning seals and swimming seals. And they will often, the birds, if a seal dies, will often predate on it. And so there's a high level of exposure and really, really close contact where those types of spreads can take place. But yeah, you're exactly right. And Seth, you might be better suited to talk about the black bear populations.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly about the avian influenza. Zach and I are both involved with efforts trying to monitor and do research on that. And we do know from that research that this particular strain of HPAI is one of the most virulent strains to ever have been studied. Avian influenza normally has a relatively small host range, usually just ducks, gulls, and some shorebirds. This has been shown to be able to impact almost every species of avian taxa and a lot of species of mammalian taxa. The reasons for that aren't entirely clear right now, but they're being studied. In terms of the changing population of gulls, people think that species are stagnant, but it's not true. Just in terms of all of the birds that have existed in Nantucket Sound, some of the birds, and on Nantucket alone, some of the birds that we see now there and are common didn't exist 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. For instance, turkey vultures. Turkey vultures before the 1990s were never found on Nantucket. Now they're one of the most common large soaring birds that we have. In the 1950s, the most common gull on Nantucket was the laughing gull. Now we have very few, almost none of them, but here in Hyannis Harbor, they're everywhere. And then over time, the laughing gull, being a small gull, was sort of outcompeted by the herring gull and is now being outcompeted by the great blackback gull, being the largest gull and most aggressive gull. But on Nantucket, at least, we have very active, very large breeding colonies of both herring and great blackback gull.
One quick question, actually two, if I can, one for you or Zach or Seth. On the lightships, migratory birds, stories were that certain times of year, they call them canaries, they're probably yellow warblers, would stop there, exhausted, take over and pick them up and keep them there for several hours and then fly back. Were they were migratory, were they yellow warblers or canary? Would have been a canary?
It's funny you mentioned, I just saw a video of this on the internet the other day. I believe they are warblers. And I know that there was some, you said canary, they were actually talking about them ahead of the hurricane, and they were getting large populations that were landing on fishing vessels and sort of hitching a ride back in. So I don't know if that's a function of the low pressure system and them following it, or if it's a true migration and they're just sort of becoming exhausted out there. But it's certainly still seeing the phenomenon.
Yeah, they're definitely warblers. Whether they're yellow warblers or not is hard to know. There's lots of species of warbler. They probably actually weren't yellow warblers because yellow warblers spend their summer in Nantucket Sound. These were probably migratory warblers like Cape May or Blackburnian or something that are trying to migrate south through here and getting stuck in a storm. So people don't often think this or know this, but warblers are small, tiny birds this big. They migrate over the open ocean. And they do so without sleeping or without really stopping. They take 3-second micro naps, some of these species, and fly continuously for hours on end. And that is very, very physically taxing. So when you see these birds getting stuck on offshore vessels or fishing boats, it's because they're just exhausted and there's no place else to land. If they didn't find that boat, they would fall into the ocean and die. So it's the best option for them at that point.
At the New England Aquarium, when the cold stun occurred, we got all sorts of turtles in and go through the whole process of getting it back. And then in February or March, we'd put them on often a Coast Guard C-130 and fly them back south. This is 30 years ago. We used to joke that they were smarter than we thought. They would come in, want to get picked up, they could spend the winter there, then have to swim south, they got a flight south. Is it true, are they that smart? I'm not even kidding.
We know. It's interesting you asked that. A lot of these turtles that are being rehabbed at New England Aquarium do get flown. Now it's by volunteer pilots. It's an organization called Turtles Fly Too. There was, in 2014 was the biggest year, and a C-130 did take a lot of them that year. But people often say, well, why haven't they learned to go around Cape Cod? I mean, every year, and it's very few repeats. We get a few repeats, like 0 to 3 every year, and we know that by tagging. But why haven't, as species, they have learned to go out? But, sea turtles are ancient species. I mean, over 100 million years old, arguably 200 million. Cape Cod is 20,000 years old. I mean, it's the blink of an eye in sea turtle evolution.
That's it. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.